Horizon, Episode 8. Their Last Sentinels, Part 1. Their Fast Route. Narrator, Captain Angus MacRae. There are two kinds of routes through the frontier. The first kind are the routes that appear on official navigation charts. They are surveyed, calculated, approved by committees, reviewed by other committees, and accompanied by enough warnings to make you wonder whether anyone involved has ever actually traveled them. The second kind are the routes experienced captains know about. They aren't on the charts, usually for good reasons. I've spent 26 years commanding the Caledonia, and I've learned that the fastest route between 2 points is occasionally the one everyone else has been sensible enough to avoid. So when the Horizon sent us our next resupply coordinates, I studied the official route for approximately 30 seconds. Then I deleted it. Talia looked over my shoulder. Captain, You deleted the navigation solution. I improved it. You deleted it. Those are two descriptions of the same event. She stared at the new route. It crossed a region of space marked with 3 separate hazard warnings. One of them was particularly enthusiastic. Transit not recommended. Another said, significant navigational instability. The third was considerably more direct. Avoid. Talia folded her arms. That's not a route. It gets us there. It's a region the Union specifically advises ships not to enter, which means there won't be much traffic. Captain, that isn't how safety recommendations work. From the navigation station, Nayak spoke without turning around. For the record, Captain, the official route is 37 hours longer. Thank you, Nayak. The route you've selected has a projected survival probability that is approximately. Nayak. Yes, Captain. Sometimes ignorance is the foundation of good leadership. There was a pause. I will record that. I looked at him. Don't. Already did. Evan laughed quietly from the pilot's station. Talia didn't. That was fine. She rarely laughed when I was doing something she considered stupid. The Caledonia entered the unofficial route. For several hours, everything went exactly as planned, which in retrospect should have worried us. The region was mostly empty, scattered with unstable electromagnetic fields and clouds of charged particles. Our engines performed well. Navigation remained within acceptable tolerances. Even Talia eventually stopped watching the displays as if they had personally offended her. Then the ship shook. Once. Hard. Every loose object in the compartment lifted several centimeters and came back down. Evan looked over his shoulder. That wasn't in the forecast. No, Nayak replied. It wasn't. Another impact followed. This one was accompanied by a sharp rise in radiation levels. Talia was already moving toward engineering. Spatial storm. I remained in my chair. How large? Large enough. That's not a measurement. It's the measurement I'm comfortable giving you at the moment. The forward displays filled with turbulence. What had looked like a relatively quiet region was suddenly alive with electromagnetic activity. The Caledonia entered the storm. The ship groaned. Artificial gravity fluctuated for several seconds before stabilizing. Warning indicators appeared across the engineering console. Shielding. Holding. Engines. Holding. Navigation. Nayak answered, becoming increasingly theoretical. I nodded. Excellent. The next wave hit. This time, the lights went out. For 3 seconds, there was nothing. No displays. No navigation. No engine readout. Only the sound of the ship itself. Then emergency power came back. Talia was standing over her console. Camouflage system is down. That got my attention. The Guardian-derived camouflage wasn't something I enjoyed thinking about. It had saved us before. It made the Caledonia harder for the Devourers to perceive, and in our line of work, being difficult to perceive was generally preferable to being noticed. Can you restart it? I'm trying. She began running diagnostics. Another energy surge passed through the ship. Talia stopped. I knew that expression. It was the expression engineers used when a machine had just done something expensive. What? The primary phase control assembly has been damaged. Can you replace it? No. Repair it? No. Improvise. She looked at me. That's not technically a repair. Didn't ask for technically. Talia sighed. I can bypass the damaged section. Good. But the system will never operate at full efficiency again. That was less good. How much efficiency? Enough that I wouldn't recommend testing it around a Devourer patrol. I looked toward the forward display. The storm continued ahead of us. Then let's make sure we don't. It took several more hours to cross the storm. By the time we emerged, the Caledonia had acquired several new warning lights, one mysterious vibration, and a permanent reduction in the effectiveness of our camouflage. Talia gave me the final report. Primary phase control assembly is beyond recovery. Nothing we can do. Not without a replacement. Do we have one? No. Could we manufacture one? Not aboard this ship. Could the Horizon? Eventually. I nodded. Eventually is useful. Talia gave me the sort of look usually reserved for people who say things like we'll worry about that later. I had spent 26 years earning that look. The important thing was that we were still ahead of schedule. The coordinates transmitted by the Horizon lay inside an unfamiliar stellar system. When we entered it, the first thing we noticed was the asteroid belt. It was enormous. Thousands of objects stretched around the star in a broad, irregular ring. Some were small enough to ignore. Others were several kilometers across. Then our sensors detected additional contacts. Naek's voice changed. Multiple vessels. How many? He didn't answer immediately. The tactical display populated. 5. Then 6. Then more. Talia came back from engineering. Those aren't civilian ships. No, I looked at the contacts. Devourers. She nodded. The bridge went quiet. We weren't equipped for a fight. The Caledonia carried defensive systems, but our job was to transport supplies, not challenge a Devourer patrol. And with the camouflage damaged, I had absolutely no interest in discovering how much of it still worked. Evan looked at the asteroid field. Could hide in there. That's what I was thinking. Naek immediately objected. The density is considerable. Navigation would be hazardous. I looked at him. Naek. Yes. Find us a rock. He paused. A specific rock. A large one. How large? Large enough to make the Devourers overlook us. Naek turned back to his console. I'll see what I can do. We entered the asteroid belt. The Caledonia reduced emissions and moved slowly between the larger bodies. The Devourers continued their patrol. They hadn't detected us. At least, we hoped they hadn't. Then Talia called from the sensor station. "Captain." I looked at her. "You're going to want to see this." A large asteroid appeared on the main display, almost 8 kilometers across. Mostly dark rock, cratered and remarkable, except for what was underneath it. The sensor image changed. A hollow space appeared inside the asteroid. Not a natural cavern, a constructed chamber. And at one end were 2 enormous geometric structures embedded directly into the rock. Doors, 2 of them. Each was hundreds of meters high, perfectly symmetrical. No visible hinges, no obvious power source, no markings we could immediately interpret. Evan leaned forward. "Those are doors." "Thank you, Evan. I thought you might want confirmation." Talia enlarged the image. "They're artificial." Nayak checked the sensor data. Construction geometry is consistent with Guardian architecture. I looked at the 2 enormous doors, 40,000 years old, hidden inside an asteroid, in a system currently occupied by Devourers. It was difficult to imagine a more suspicious coincidence. Talia was already studying the access systems. "Can we open them?" I looked at her. "You're the engineer." That wasn't an answer. It was the best one I had. She sighed. Then she smiled very slightly. "I'll see what I can do." The Caledonia moved closer. We found a narrow opening between 2 enormous rocks and slipped through. The doors remained completely silent. No lights, no signals, nothing. The kind of nothing that makes experienced people nervous. Talia began working. For several minutes, the only sounds on the bridge were the consoles and the distant hum of the engines. Then she stopped. "Captain, I think I've found the control system. Can you open it?" "Maybe." I stood. That's usually how these things begin. She ignored me. A sequence appeared on her console. Then another. Something inside the asteroid responded. Deep beneath us, ancient machinery began to move. The sound was almost impossible to describe. Not loud. Not exactly. It was a vibration transmitted through the asteroid itself. Dust fell from the surrounding rock. The 2 enormous doors shifted. Slowly, very slowly. A gap appeared between them. Beyond it was darkness. Talia increased the external lighting. The beam traveled into the chamber and kept going. The space beyond the doors was enormous. Much larger than the Caledonia. Much larger than anything that had any business being hidden inside an asteroid. I stared into the darkness. Then I said the only sensible thing that came to mind. "Well." Evan smiled. "That's one hell of a garage." Talia looked at him. "It's not a garage." I looked at the cavern. Technically, it has doors, a large interior space and room for vehicles. Talia closed her eyes. "Captain." "Yes." "Please don't call it a garage." I smiled. "Fine." I looked again at the ancient structure. Hangar. And somewhere beyond those enormous doors, 40,000 years of darkness waited for us. The hidden hangar. The first thing I learned about the hangar was that it was considerably larger than necessary. The second thing I learned was that, when dealing with Guardian technology, The phrase larger than necessary was almost meaningless. The Caledonia entered slowly. Evan kept the engines at minimum power, while Talia monitored the ancient systems around us. The chamber was vast. The ceiling disappeared into darkness several hundred meters above us, while the floor extended far beyond the reach of our forward lights. There were no obvious maintenance platforms, no equipment, no storage containers, no signs that anyone had used the place for thousands of years. Just an enormous empty space carved into the asteroid. Nayak checked the sensors. Structural integrity is remarkably high. How high? Very high. I waited. He looked at me. What? You usually give me numbers. I am attempting to determine whether the numbers would be useful. They usually are. Not always. Talia interrupted. The structure is stable. Good. The internal atmosphere is almost non-existent. Also good. The radiation level is negligible. Excellent. She hesitated. There's something else. I sighed. Of course there is. Power. She pointed toward the engineering display. Very low, but there is still an active power network. I looked around the hangar. 40,000 years. No maintenance. No visible energy source. And yet something was still working. That was becoming a familiar experience aboard the Caledonia. I ordered Evan to bring us farther inside. The Caledonia's landing lights illuminated a series of markings on the floor. Long parallel lines, parking positions, maintenance corridors. And then we saw the first ship. Evan stopped the Caledonia. Nobody spoke. The vessel rested several hundred meters ahead of us. It was small, much smaller than the horizon, perhaps only 20 meters long. Angular, compact, almost elegant. Its hull was dark, covered in layers of dust, and whatever residue 40,000 years had deposited on a machine left in darkness. There was no visible cockpit, no conventional engine assembly, no obvious weapon ports, and yet the shape immediately suggested one thing. It had not been built for exploration. Talia slowly approached with the scanners. There's a second vessel. She moved the display. Another ship appeared farther inside the hangar. Similar dimensions, similar architecture, but very different condition. The first looked almost intact. The second looked as though it had been through a war. A section of its hull was missing. Several structural components had collapsed. Its forward section had been heavily damaged. I looked at the two vessels. Those are Guardian ships. Cale would have enjoyed that moment. Unfortunately, he wasn't there. I could already imagine his expression. Not because we'd found them. Because I'd probably call them warships before he had enough evidence to approve the term. I contacted the horizon. Nothing. The communication system was deliberately silent. With Devourers somewhere in the system, we couldn't risk broadcasting our position. So for the moment, the discovery belonged to us. Talia brought the Caledonia closer to the intact vessel. The scanners ran across its hull. Definitely Guardian construction. Any idea what it was used for? Not yet. She expanded the scan, then frowned. There's a lot of internal power. How much? More than a vessel this size should have. That got my attention. Weapons. Possibly. Possibly. Their systems are unfamiliar. I smiled. You're telling me you don't know. I'm telling you I haven't finished. Much more reassuring. Talia ignored me. She continued the scan. A few seconds later, she looked up. Captain, I think I know what these were. She rotated the holographic image. Several sections of the hull became highlighted. These aren't sensor arrays. No, those aren't communication systems. No. She isolated several structures concealed beneath the hull. Those are weapons. I stared at the ship. How many? Several. What kind? I don't know yet. Are they operational? Probably not. Probably. Talia looked at me. Do you want me to stop saying probably? Not particularly. She went back to the scanner. The intact ship was heavily armed. Not large. Not fast, as far as we knew. But heavily armed. It was beginning to look less like a patrol craft and more like a small combat vessel. A Guardian combat vessel. The second ship provided the final confirmation. Its damaged hull had exposed part of the weapons architecture. Their systems were unmistakable. These ships had been built to fight. That discovery was uncomfortable. We had spent months reconstructing the Guardians through observatories, archives, settlements, and scientific facilities. The picture emerging from those places was of a civilization that had preferred knowledge to conquest. But knowledge did not mean pacifism. They had faced the Devourers for thousands of years. Of course, they had built weapons. The important question was why. Talia continued her examination. These ships weren't designed for large crews. How many? Maybe 6. 6. Possibly fewer. I looked at the vessel again. A 6-person warship. Compact. Heavily armed. Designed around efficiency rather than comfort. The Union had nothing quite like it. Our military vessels were considerably larger. Our defensive systems relied on layered fleet operations. These Guardians had apparently built something different. Small enough to disappear, powerful enough to matter, and old enough to make us wonder how much of their technology had been lost. I walked down toward the nearest vessel. The hangar floor was covered in dust, except for one narrow area near the ship. Talia noticed it too. That's strange. What? There's less dust here. I looked at the floor. She was right. The difference was subtle. Very subtle. But unmistakable. A narrow path ran from the maintenance corridor toward the intact ship. Could be airflow. There's almost no atmosphere. Then, she didn't finish. I didn't ask her to. We continued toward the vessel. There was no evidence of recent activity. No footprints. No fresh damage. No functioning lights. Nothing that suggested anyone had been here recently. But the floor remained cleaner around the ship than anywhere else. Perhaps the ancient ventilation system had continued operating. Perhaps something else had disturbed the dust. We didn't know. And I had learned, during my time with the Horizons people, that the sentence "we don't know" was usually the beginning of an investigation. Not the end. Talia found a small access panel. It opened with surprisingly little resistance. Inside were layers of unfamiliar components. Some were completely dead. Others were still drawing minute amounts of power. She connected a diagnostic interface. The screen came alive. Not fully. Just a few symbols. Then a translation layer began working. Talia read the output. Designation. She paused. What does it say? Not sure. She adjusted the translator. A second interpretation appeared. One word. Vigil. I looked at the vessel. Vigil. Talia nodded. That's the closest translation. Sounds appropriate. She looked at the damaged vessel. That one has a different designation. Can we translate it? Not yet. Try. She did. The system produced several possibilities. None were complete. Then the translator gave up. I shrugged. Vigil it is. We stood there for another moment. Then Naek's voice came over the internal channel. Captain. I returned to the bridge. What is it? Long-range sensors have detected movement. My smile disappeared. Devourers. Yes. How many? At least 5 confirmed vessels. Talia looked toward me. The hangar suddenly seemed much less like a discovery and much more like a shelter. I looked at the enormous doors. Can they detect the asteroid? Unknown. Can they detect us? Not currently. Good. I returned to the bridge. The Caledonia moved deeper into the hangar. We positioned the ship beside the intact Guardian vessel. Then we shut down almost everything. Engines to standby. Communications silent. External lighting reduced. The enormous doors began to close. Slowly, the last visible strip of the asteroid field disappeared. Then the doors met. Darkness. For the first time since entering the system, we were completely hidden. Nobody spoke. We didn't need to. Outside, the Devourers were searching. Inside, we were sitting beside a 40,000-year-old Guardian combat vessel. And somewhere in the distance, the horizon was still approaching the system. We had no idea whether Amelia and her crew had already arrived. We couldn't contact them. They couldn't contact us. All we could do was wait. Naek broke the silence. Captain, I believe we should remain here until the horizon arrives. I looked at him. That's the first sensible thing anyone has said today. Talia glanced at me. You mean besides me telling you not to take the shortcut? I considered that. No, she smiled. It was the first time she had done so since we entered the storm. Then the hangar fell silent again. For the next few hours, the Caledonia waited in darkness. And outside, the Devourers searched the system. Contact in the dark. We waited. That is one of the least appreciated skills in space travel. People imagine exploration involves discovering things, making decisions, flying somewhere dangerous, and occasionally pressing buttons that nobody understands. In reality, a considerable portion of exploration involves sitting in a dark room while nothing happens, and hoping it stays that way. The Caledonia had been inside the Guardian hangar for nearly 4 hours when Naek reported movement outside. New contacts. I looked toward him. Devourers. Yes. How many? 3 confirmed. Possibly more beyond the asteroid belt. Talia glanced at the tactical display. They're moving toward the inner system. I leaned back. Looking for us. Impossible to determine. Naek paused. They may not know we're here. Let's continue encouraging that assumption. We remained silent. The Caledonia systems were reduced to the minimum required to keep the crew alive and the ship ready to move. No unnecessary transmissions. No active sensors. No external lights. Even the internal lighting was reduced. It was strange, sitting inside that enormous hangar. The darkness beyond the windows wasn't the darkness of ordinary space. There was no sky, no stars, no distant light, just the interior of an ancient structure that had been sealed for 40,000 years. And beside us stood two ships that had apparently been built for a war none of us had ever seen. Talia spent most of the waiting period examining the intact vessel. Every few minutes, she sent another scan through its systems. I eventually asked her what she expected to find. The answer. "To what?" She looked at me. "How it works. That's ambitious. That's engineering. Same thing." "No," she returned to her console. "Engineering requires evidence. That's why I leave it to engineers." Nayak interrupted. "Captain, long-range sensors have detected a vessel entering the system." I sat upright. Identification. He checked the display, then looked at me. Horizon. For the first time in several hours, I smiled. Finally, the UGS Horizon had arrived. The problem was that she had arrived at exactly the wrong place. The first thing the Horizon would detect upon entering the system was the same thing we had detected: Devourers. And the Horizon had one major disadvantage compared with us. She was considerably harder to hide. Nayak watched the incoming data. The Horizon has not transmitted. Good. They've activated their camouflage. Better. Multiple Devourer vessels are changing course. Less good. Talia looked toward me. How long before they reach her? Can you tell? Nayak shook his head. Not accurately. I looked at the enormous hangar doors, then at the Horizon's position on the tactical display. We couldn't contact them. Not conventionally. A normal transmission would be exactly what the Devourers would be looking for. We needed something narrower, something directional, something that wouldn't advertise our presence to half the system. Talia suddenly looked toward the Guardian control systems. Maybe we don't need to transmit through the Caledonia. I followed her gaze. What are you thinking? This facility still has power. A little. Enough for some systems. Probably. She gave me a look. I am not using your word. I smiled. What are you thinking? She moved toward one of the ancient control stations. I think the hangar had a guidance system. 4 ships. Possibly. Can we use it? I'm going to find out. Talia began working. The ancient interface responded slowly. Symbols appeared. Most were meaningless to us. Some were not. One resembled a directional marker. Another appeared to indicate external communication. Talia studied it. Then her eyes widened slightly. There's an optical transmitter. Laser. Something similar. Can it reach the Horizon? If I can align it, then align it. She hesitated. There's a problem. Of course. The system is designed to communicate with ships that already know this facility exists. So, it expects a recognition sequence. I looked at her. Can we provide one? Not yet. Nayak came over. Together, they began comparing the ancient system with the sensor data from the Horizon. I watched them work. This was one of those moments when the Caledonia reminded me why I liked having people smarter than me aboard. I didn't need to understand what they were doing. I only needed them to succeed. Outside, the Devourers continued moving. The horizon had gone completely silent. We had no idea whether the Devourers had detected her. For several minutes, nothing changed. Then Nayak spoke. The horizon has altered course. Toward us. Impossible to know. I looked at Talia. How long? Almost. That's engineer language for 30 seconds. Excellent. She activated the transmitter. A narrow beam of coherent light crossed the darkness. No radio signal. No broad-spectrum emission. Just a precise laser pulse directed toward the horizon. Then another. Talia watched the display. Did they receive it? Nayak checked. Unknown. We waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then the transmitter responded. A tiny acknowledgement appeared. The horizon had received the signal. I let out a breath. Good. Talia continued, sending the coordinates. The horizon adjusted course. Her engines remained at minimal output. She disappeared behind several large asteroids, then reappeared. Slowly, carefully, the ship approached the asteroid containing the hangar. From our position, we could see almost nothing. Only a faint distortion against the darkness. The camouflage was working, but not perfectly. The horizon entered the shadow of the asteroid. Talia activated the ancient guidance system again. The hangar doors remained closed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the outer panels moved. The enormous doors began to open. Slowly, their horizon approached. A silhouette appeared between the doors. Even after all the time I'd spent with that ship, seeing the horizon enter that ancient structure was impressive. The Guardian hangar was built around vessels much smaller than her. The horizon seemed enormous inside it. She reduced speed. Evan brought her deeper into the chamber. The hangar lights activated one by one. Not many. Just enough. The horizon moved past the Caledonia and settled into position. Then the doors closed again. Darkness returned. But this time, we weren't alone. I opened a secure internal channel. Welcome to the garage. There was a pause. Then Amelia Carter's voice came through. MacRae. Commander. Are you all right? Perfectly. Talia looked at me. I ignored her. Amelia continued. We lost your signal. A temporary communications issue. You've been missing for several hours. Technically, we've been hiding. From the Devourers. Among other things. There was another pause. Then Amelia asked, what did you find? I looked through the viewport. The ancient hangar. The 2 Guardian vessels. The enormous doors. The 40,000-year-old silence surrounding us. Something interesting. How interesting. I considered that. Interesting enough that I'd recommend bringing Kale. There was silence on the channel. Then Amelia said, I already have him. Of course she did. The horizon began shutting down its external systems. Within minutes, a small team crossed from the ship into the hangar. Amelia arrived first. Marcus Donnelly followed. Cale Veris was close behind them, already looking at the walls rather than the people. Lyra came next. And naturally, the first thing Marcus did was look at the Guardian vessel. He stopped, wailed. I knew that expression. It was the same one engineers got when they discovered a machine they desperately wanted to take apart. Marcus walked closer. That's Guardian. Talia nodded. 2 of them. Marcus turned toward her. 2. She pointed toward the second vessel. His expression changed. That once been through hell. Apparently, Cale approached the intact vessel. He didn't touch it. He simply stood there, studying the hull. These were not civilian vessels. No, I said. Cale looked at the weapons architecture. Defensive craft. Marcus disagreed. More than defensive. Cale looked at him. Marcus pointed toward the hull. Look at the weapon placement. Cale studied it again, then nodded slowly. Combat vessels. Nobody said anything for a moment. It was a small discovery, but an important one. For the first time since the horizon had begun following the Guardian trail, we were looking directly at something built not to observe the universe, but to fight in it. Amelia looked toward the 2 ships. How old? Cale answered. Approximately 40,000 years. She looked at the intact vessel. And it still has power. Talia nodded. Very little. Marcus walked around the hull. Enough, apparently. He crouched beside one of the exposed systems, then smiled. I knew that smile. It meant we were about to have a problem. Or an opportunity. With Marcus, those were usually the same thing. He stood. Captain, how attached are you to your spare parts? I looked at him, then at the damaged Guardian vessel, then back at Marcus. Why? He smiled. Because I think I can make that one fly.